Okay, welcome everybody to 2023 and to LawFi DAO, Digital Organization Design Workshops. We're very lucky to have the Multilateral Group, Andrew, Will and Duncan on the call here today. Thank you for all your efforts and your time. They are going to be guiding us through today and the next 2 weeks of workshops and setting homework for us. So I'll shortly hand over to Andrew to kick us off. As you all are aware, these sessions are being recorded and will be made available on the LawFi DAO YouTube channel in pursuit of our purposes to open source our learnings and help educate the public, including regulators, the judiciary, other lawyers, and so forth. We would also like to extend our warm respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands from which we join today. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri land and would encourage you to put where you're joining from in the chat. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andrew to formally open the session and kick us off. You should have all received if you are a member of LawFi DAO or an active participant today, you would have received the PowerPoint presentation, which I believe Duncan will share. But for any members that don't have access to that, please put a note in the chat or email me and I'll make sure that you also have your copy to take away today. All right, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Joni. So for everybody who's been on the community calls through the back end of last year will know that one of the things we've been talking about has been how we structure up the organisation. And I've mentioned a number of times the work that Multilateral Group are doing in terms of organisational design. And we reached out to Joni and suggested that, especially after having a look at the white paper and then taking the white paper through the AGM and getting the feedback from the members at that time, that actually it was a really good opportunity for us to corroborate, I would say, in terms of working through some of the work we've been doing in the digital organisation design work and actually apply it to a use case for LawFi DAO so that we can work through this group of workshops collectively with active participation from the members and friends, and extend that invitation out to observers as well to just look at what we're doing, how we're doing it, what's the stuff under the hood that makes it work. And that's the intent of these next 3 weeks, is to work through that, get everybody involved. And Joni used the word homework. We actually took homework off the list and we called it an assignment, which is like homework, I guess. But there is work for everybody to put in, and there is for our Multilateral Group team as well. As many of you would know from the community calls, I act on behalf of Multilateral Group, but I've now brought in, and for this workshop, we've got all 4 members of Multilateral Group on the call, Will, Duncan and Grant. We're all here to work through the process. Just by way of today, what our agenda is for today is we're going to walk you through the Exemplar model overview. That will be led by Duncan, who's effectively our engineer that has built the models up along with the rest of the team. Those of you that have had a look through the presentation pack will have seen all the diagrams underneath all the narrative. And whilst the narrative makes some key points which are quite clear and we've been consistent and worked through with some of the asset comments as well there, the diagrams need some walking through, and I'm sure have opened up a number of questions for those of you that have had a look. That's very much an interactive session to work through those, particularly the first couple of diagrams, and give you a heads up of how that works. At the end of today's session, we'll be giving to the participants the assignment brief, which has a handout that also has those diagrams in them and some additional information around assumptions and the like. After we go through that section, we'll then open up the floor for some insights, participant insights on what you've found in the LawFi DAO white paper and just put a little bit of context around that and how some of what we're perhaps proposing here in the model overview, how that can work and be of context there, and perhaps flag some of the issues that might have come out of the white paper that we want to work through over the next couple of weeks. Again, we've posed 4 questions, which I know a number of you have already started thinking about some of your responses to those. That again will be the next session, which is the participant insights in those 4 questions, which we'll work through. That's going to pretty much take up those 3 chunks are going to take up pretty much most of our 90 minutes. And then at the end, we'll just look at the assignment brief, really ask those questions around for participants to think about what's missing in the model, what your insights of the day have been, and start thinking about how you believe you can contribute over the journey over the next number of weeks. That's all there. Then we'll hand it back to Joni to close off as well. But I very much want you to think also, and we'll talk about this later on back in, perhaps at this insight piece at the back end, but think about what your needs are within the context of LawFi DAO and what your expectations are of participation in and contribution to. So maybe just in setting context, have a bit of a think about some of those things. But now I'll pass over to Duncan to start working us through some of those drawings, and please feel free to put your hand up. Joni, I guess in the chat is probably the best place to do that, to ask a question, and jump in where you want to and where you want to ask particular questions. Over to you, Duncan.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I have flicked through some of the pages of the presentation while Andrew was speaking, but I want to get to the gritty stuff. Really, when we commenced the model design, we had 2 simple questions that needed to be answered, which is, what do you want your DAO to do? And how do you want it to do it? And that's the critical bit. That's the operational side of the DAO. So in going forward, we're examining the difference between the contemporary centralized organization based on people and roles to a digital organization, which isn't. And we looked at some of the challenges. More specifically, and I'll just cover this, we see some outcomes from the workshops. We want at the end of the workshop to have a first draft, not final drafts, a first draft of a blueprint. We believe it's necessary for any organisational build to have a blueprint, a plan. And we also want to identify an implementation action plan. There are gaps, there are things that need to be done. And as Andrew said, we're looking for people who have the potential to participate and to contribute in the outstanding actions to build up what we're calling a minimum viable product or operational environment for LawFi DAO. Post activities, we see work to be done to take us through to a final draft of the blueprint, which can be presented and formally approved, endorsed, approved by the membership. And at that stage, looking for a fully resourced implementation plan. We have who does what by when, and we have a very well-defined runway to getting a operational capability up and running. The 3 workshops Andrew's covered. The second workshop will be looking at the assignment and your input and feedback on there. As you'll see, the concept of member class is significant to our model, and we want to explore some of the member class ramifications, implications from today's session, and then get ready for the 3rd workshop, where we're really looking at the member class functionality, and in particular there, as we'll talk about, authorities and delegations and the member rights, benefits, obligations and liabilities. So those cryptic comments will be fully explained, hopefully in the next quarter of an hour to 20 minutes. So just as context, and I hope everyone can read it, we had a look at the problem and defining the problem definition for a DAO to operate here and now without a supporting regulatory environment. We came up with some concerns or some considerations that need to be taken into account. First of all, we've got to operate with the contemporary. We've got to operate with individuals, other DAOs, registered organisations and the government. So our community needs to operate. We can't be isolated. That was the first thing. We also need the DAO to have an effective operational environment. So that's balancing between pure decentralization and what we're calling areas of consolidation, which makes sense to bring in a level of centralisation. And we've listed there there are more areas where we even think consolidation is necessary just by the nature of the function. And the 4 we've mentioned is governance, quality management, risk and procurement. There are others, but they're the 4 big ones that certainly experienced and operated in for a lot of my time in the workforce. We also want to acknowledge that we've got grey. We've got a lot of grey, and so we have to have the potential to move and to deal with that grey as it becomes clearer. The value and benefit realisation, flexibility to attract people to participate, members to participate. And very important for us in our value chain is to demonstrate to the community and the external stake of the DAO that the obligation, so compliance, we are walking the talk and we're doing what we say we're going to do. So we have our mantra. We've talked about regulatory requirements. Our basis there is through contractual rights and obligations. So through, and we'll talk about this later, through shareholder agreement, through constitutions, or through any other, a mix of contractual capabilities, establish a line of sight between the DAO activity and current and likely regulation. So we can show that we're not outside the norms or community or public sector expectation in terms of behaviour. Functional equivalence is to provide those obvious areas of consolidation, so for efficiency. And the main point is we're wanting to end up with our external facing, these being current regulated entities, which provide those known points of control and interaction with non-DAO environments. So the 3 main factors or 3 main operational components that comprise this: stakeholder identity and delegation of authorities, attribution and allocation of benefit and liability. Based on a profile of algorithms, we need to be able to fractionalize into the DAO benefit and liability and have awareness of where that. And the last one is a service delivery. It's a digital environment. We're most likely going to be predominantly service, and it's getting a digital-based service delivery. This is something personally I've been working on, not just inside the DAO environment, but other environments. And the aim there is one-click procurement. It is a goal. And when you think about that and everything that means, it's quite an ambitious goal, but certainly the DAO environment is one which that goal can be reached. Regulatory requirements is very much based on, first of all, let's talk about the stakeholder model. So in our stakeholder model, we acknowledge a stakeholder to be any individual entity that can hold a reputation. Key to the Web3 environment is the concept of pseudonym. But if you look at modern or contemporary environments, Multilateral Group is a pseudonym for the 4 members who are currently here. So brand is a pseudonym. So if you look at the current Web3 environment and the current contemporary environment, there is a lot of commonality in terms of that pseudonym capability. But in dealing from an operational perspective, what we need to be able to assure ourselves and our various regulated bodies is that the authorised officer associated with that stakeholder is authorised, has appropriate delegations from whatever entity, whether it be a proto-entity or an existing regulated entity, to actually commit that stakeholder, particularly to the obligations that they're saying up. So we have the concept of a stakeholder, let's say a company, a proprietary limited company, and then that stakeholder has delegated to authorised members of the stakeholder delegations with regards to a regulated entity. Obviously, directors and company officers have prescribed environments. In a situation of a stakeholder, we've termed a proto-entity, which is a group of people getting together to decide what they want to do. That then is more by a claim, or there's an agreement amongst those participating that the individual is authorised to commit. So that's the first part of the regulatory equivalence. The second part is then we have member classes. So member classes basically allow a collection of rights and obligations to be assigned to a member who has successfully onboarded to that class or met the onboarding requirements and conditions to get that class. We can have no member classes. We can have as many member classes in the model as needed. And any particular member can be a member without any allocation to a member class, or can be allocated to every member class in the organisation. Then through that membership, the onboarding and the rights and obligations assigned during the onboarding of individual members and onboarding to member class, we then build that contractual collection of rights and obligations, which will end up allowing the model to have one or more regulated entities as the external interface to the contemporary environments. So we have dubbed, for example, the DAO Administrator would probably be the main regulated entity for a DAO to interact with the centralized world, and the members' rights and obligations associated with that regulated entity would be handled through the underlying contractual environment that is maintained. In a digital environment, we'd obviously be seeing that being managed by smart contracts. There are, I won't go into them, but there are some obvious complexities. And in particular, I'll just say up front, it is the offboarding of members from member classes and offboarding of members from the DAO, which will actually probably create our greatest level of complexity and deep thought on how we handle that, particularly with survivability of obligations. Any comments or questions people would like to jump in here before I go on to the next slide?
I might just add one thing, just another perspective that is topical right now is, what are we doing in DAOs? What is the innovation? And we're trying to get more democratic voting by more people holding governance tokens and having a right to vote. Is that actually more democratic, or is it more transparent because before a person votes, they might see more rich discussions in the Discord, and more detail than you would get from a carefully cured disclosure document prior to an AGM, for example. And there's a term that is forming in my mind, which I'm wrestling with, and it's a play on stakeholder capitalism or shareholder capitalism. Instead, with DAOs, I prefer the term stakeholder equalism, and where we see more foods of thought around equal opportunity, and that organizations that promote diversity, inclusion, and equal opportunity not just encourage and incentivize greater and more rich participation, but it's also been shown to increase profitability. Now, in a DAO's context, it may not be profitability, it might be the ongoing utility of a public good. And so I'm really coming to these workshops with trying to buff out what my understanding of this concept of stakeholder, not shareholder, stakeholder equalism as a new sort of economic model to think about how we're going about our DAO and how other DAOs might piggyback off these concepts. So just as a contextual note, and get the creative juices flowing as well.
Thanks, Joni. Duncan, a question from Kelsey around the offboarding of member. What do you mean deliberately wanting to offboard a member or lack of participation?
Both, every possibility. We have, if you have a look at the most closely aligned current regulated environment is cooperatives law. And a big chunk of that is about member death, the lack of participation. Certainly with member classes, some of the use case examples we have with member classes is if we have delivery of services, then the provider of service has to be of a particular member class. To get on board, that provider or that stakeholder has to be able to prove a capacity to provide the service and maintain a series of obligations, particularly around things like professional indemnity or other capabilities that they need to maintain their eligibility to be a provider, a service provider. Now, if a stakeholder fails to maintain that eligibility, we can do options like they can go into suspension prior to fixing up, no corrective action, and then be back up. Or the other alternative is they actually get moved on or not allowed or expelled from the member class. So there's that capability, as well as people saying, I don't want to do this anymore. And as I've said, the obvious one is the stakeholder doesn't exist because the worst case is a death or a winding up of an organisation. They're the ones that I've just pulled out. I'm sure there's probably more, and it'll be a bit conditional on what the member class has been instantiated for and to manage. So there's a lot of scenario planning, and there's a lot of what-if activities which will be included in the identification of the member classes and the onboarding and offboarding scenarios that would have to be handled.
Thank you.
That is the concept of functional equivalence. And as I said, this is about efficiency and effectiveness. I think beyond the obvious topics that we talked about, governance, quality management, risk and procurement, where there is definite advantages of a consolidation of responsibility and accountability, because that then allows those functions need organisation-wide views to be able to identify both improvements and corrective actions in case of issue. There's some straight operational efficiencies, and the example or the use case I use is the payment of bills, for example. Is that something that is going to be handled by a collective vote from the DAO? No, it's not. It needs to be delegated to someone, but we want to have a delegation capability which is potentially stepped. For example, we give Andrew the delegation to pay a bill or approve bill payment up to $1,000. What I then do is also in that delegation say above $1,000, Andrew would be responsible for managing or initiating the process necessary defined for bills over $1,000. So when I talk about functional equivalence and accountability, scope and concentration, it's that level of capability that I'm looking to do, and do it in such a way there's high visibility of who has what, and that is something that is digitally. From my background, an operations and business transformation specialist, I go into organisations and often the first thing I ask is, have you got a delegation register? And more often than not, surprisingly, the answer is no. So in this environment, we think a core building block of a DAO's operational environment is a very rigid yet nimble authorities and delegations register. And what this then allows us to do is clump together a series of functions and responsibilities and have the DAO membership agree that gets delegated to a stakeholder or a member of the DAO. The other side of this, and thinking about it, if you look at contemporary environments, governance, operational governance and delegation is typically aligned to an organisational chart. That, and I'm sure if I say that, everyone will nod. What it means is, particularly at the C-suite, there's one second level report who gets lumbered with all the odd bod functions and accountabilities that isn't obviously given to someone else, typically corporate services. And so there's this eclectic collection of accountabilities and authorities with one person. Now, what we see here in the DAO as opportunity is governance by design. We don't have to worry about direct report constraints. We can have as many consolidations of accountability and responsibility as we see fit, as it makes sense, as suits the purpose of the DAO and the operational model that has been created for the DAO. And this has also allowed the last thing, and this is not so much for LawFi DAO, but certainly something that we're considering. The other difference between a digital organisation is a contemporary one. I can stand up a contemporary organisation now. All I needed to do is meet the requirements of getting an ACN. I have an organisation. The way I can get away with that operationally is then I can say, Andrew, you're responsible for customer journey and marketing. Joni, you're responsible for legal. William, you're responsible for communications. I'm responsible for operations. And it's a person-directed capability. With a pure digital organisation, that's not the case. We haven't got that level of ease of just saying we don't need processes or systems. We can just designate it to a person. We do need the processes and systems if it's a truly digital environment supported by smart contracts and service delivery capability. We need to have those things defined. And we see it also an opportunity that we can model these things, we can template these activities so that in a future state, someone wants to stand up a digital organisation or DAO, there is a plethora of what people have done in the past that can be drawn upon to quickly enable a viable operating environment to be established for the new digital organisation. Any questions on the functional equivalence page before I move on?
What I wanted to add was Duncan and I early next week are actually going to try and do this exercise for the vision of LawFi DAO activities in the draft version of the white paper. We're going to go and literally put the functions in the boxes and visually map it out to present it as a point of discussion in workshops 2 or 3. I'm really excited about that and can't wait for it.
Yeah, let's see. It's a fairly dry subject. I'm bringing in...
Careful what you wish for, Joni.
This is based on work that I've done for my consulting practice, where we've done a lot of organisational restructuring and doing that functions and process definitions of established organisations. So we're not starting off with a green piece of paper in a greenfields environment. We also want to recognise there's a lot of good value in the contemporary corporate environment, and we should be cherry picking that as much as we can. It's silly to say there's nothing of value there. Okay, the regulatory and functional equivalent, the major ties in terms of what we want to do. We've talked about there's operations and systems is critical for that. And we've identified here 4 major systems that we believe the Exemplar model needs to have to be functioning. The stakeholder identity and delegation engine is something that we've talked about. So it's stakeholder and digital identity. So it's the stakeholder information plus the digital identity associated for the authorised officers of that stakeholder, so we can vote and do other activities, approve things, smart contract interaction with a wallet. There is, I'll say now, from a technical risk point of view, I've had this discussion with some of the Web3 designers. I have a problem. My background is digital transformation. Having a smart contract, even if it's a multi-sig environment, having the digital identity hardwired into the smart contract is ignoring the truism that the maintenance total life cost of a system compared to the implementation cost is between 5 and 10 times. So what you really want to look at is efficiency in your system maintenance, and having a stakeholder delegations register, which is an oracle for smart contracts to poll for authorised officers, while it does introduce a vector for malicious behaviour, it's a risk assessment. So we've got to think about the underlying cost of maintaining these digital environments as a key factor. The second one is the Exemplar outcome delivery engine. Sorry, everyone, I love naming things. It's one of the first things I do. Andrew and I were involved with a co-op series. We were involved with getting 5 cooperatives registered, and very much the basis of that was a service directory. The first one of those, which was the Innovation Cooperative, was built on the concept of participating members delivering non-core services, i.e. accounting, marketing, consuming, to people in an accelerator mode. And that was going to be managed by a service directory. We did a lot of work from that, and we dragged that concept forward. Subsequently, I've used portions of that work to actually deliver service directory definitions to state government department and some other places. So we have a history of a service directory definition and automation capability, and we've really finished it off with the outcome delivery engine. And as I said, the goal here is a one-click procurement. A big part of that interaction, as I said, is one of the clear separations of a member class is the provision of services. And so therefore the terms and conditions or the rights and obligations of a service provider is actually awarded to that stakeholder on onboarding to that member class. In a pure DAO environment, your consumers of services could also be a member class. And therefore the one-click procurement is really only associated with any specific service considerations that would need to take place. The underlying legal framework for the provider and the consumer of services is actually handled by the onboarding into the member class. So we see that as a possible technique. With LawFi DAO, we have the public as consumers. Therefore, we'll have to take that into consideration, and the public will have to accept terms and conditions in receiving the benefits they're going to receive from LawFi DAO. But that is obviously a model that needs to be handled by most everyone. The last one I'm not going to talk a lot about because it will be mainly part of workshop 3 is our dynamic attribution and allocation system. We have a prototype environment of combining treasury and the ability to write both benefit and liability algorithms to fractionalize benefit and liability and have those as predefined algorithms which people sign on to at the start of engagement. And that's crucial in a DAO. I only talk about what we think the great innovation of a DAO is having people having a very good understanding of what's in it for them on both sides of the ledger, both benefit and liability, when they're participating in an activity of a DAO because of the DAAS. The last system here is onboarding. Obviously, the onboarding is a crucial capability. There should be also offboarding, because as we said, it's about achieving a very clear evidence of understanding and acceptance of the rights and obligations associated with membership or allocation to a member class. The last one is what we've called content creation and management. And this is actually the process of creating an exemplar model. And this is where right here and right now, I believe is the greatest opportunity for contribution by people looking at this video. And that is the building of the content, the templates and the specific subject matter or topic versions can be used efficiently in a tool set to stand up an exemplar model DAO quickly. This is a concept diagram where we see 2 elements, a design toolkit, which allows you to interrogate and choose from a library of templates and opportunities, the exemplar blueprint, which can be looked at and configured and tweaked. And once that is happy by the organization, the second toolkit is then from that blueprint, a digital build of a capability. Now, there's lots of elements in there which go into detail of all the components and modules that would be needed, but we have a lot of these in play, either at a conceptual design or prototype. So we believe that we've got a fairly good basis of being able to stand up capability right now. The other side of it is I'm a believer of if you can't do it manually, you can't do it digitally. So what we're looking at the moment, a MVP operational environment, is a combination of manual process and prototypes before we have to invest in any significant software development or acquisition. We also see very important to our exemplar environment is the concept of guilds. So these are DAOs, which are subject matter experts. I'll throw it back to Andrew just to talk a little bit about the exemplar guild concept.
Yeah, this goes to the overall heart of the model as well, is looking at an individual's specialties in particular areas of expertise and being able to contribute as part of the whole. And a lot of this will come down to the design of the member classes, which is one of the things we'll start looking at next week. But one of the important things out of the group of people we're talking to today that are participating in this, and also those that are observing, is the concept of dimensions and the concept of looking at multi-perspective views. What we've looked to do pulling together this group is that we've got people that are not only experts that come from the legal field and digital law, but we've also got individuals that can give an insurance perspective, can give a finance perspective, can give an accounting perspective, etc. And we believe pulling all of those groups together will give us, over the course of the 3 weeks, the best possible chance to build up an all-inclusive model that can then build it into something that's robust from an operating perspective as well. And the guilds will be part of that. Some of those will feed up into some of the more structural stuff that we're talking about. Thanks, Kelsey, for an ethnographic perspective as well. So you can see, we talked earlier on about the equalism concept that Joni had as well. All of these parts are inherently possible within a DAO structure. It's a matter of putting the structure together in the first place. So that kind of part answers your question, Duncan. Part of it is open up for us to explore over the next couple of weeks. But I did want to move on to get participants' input from some of the issues that they may have seen in the white paper and how some of those burning points could be looked at in context of building up this. Perhaps a place to kick off there while we're waiting for questions to come through is the complexity of having dual purpose. And this does flow to a certain extent with some of the self-reflective questions that we've got coming up as well. And perhaps both sessions really apply across the board. But if we look at the dual purpose of LawFi DAO, one part it is looking at making what started out as legal services through pay to rely more affordable, so accessible to a broader pool, and we'd widen that out to say professional services in general, but because they're the same sort of principles involved. That's one piece that needs to be addressed by a certain level of regulation and authorities. But then on the other hand, we've got the goals of education and wider influence to policymakers, etc., and how they open up and how we look at addressing those and bring them together in, as ASIC said to us, work with stuff that already exists as a place to start. Perhaps that opens up the floor for thinking and question.
Alex, I'm going to go to you first with insurance, because we all know there's a lack of availability of insurance out there for these sorts of activities. And if we're not doing them in a limited liability-ized container, what's your reaction to assigning particular stakeholders to do certain things and the benefits of those things as well as the liabilities attached to them? What does that spark for you in terms of red flags or green flags even?
Yeah, so there's two sides to it. One is, whilst the mechanism sitting behind the DAO is the more parallel they are to existing arrangements. For example, we were talking about this the other day. If we've got, for example, a DAO administrator or a reference point or whatever else, then I think that there's going to be a lot of activity that's quite coverable from an insurance perspective because of the parallels that exist mapping back to existing insurance that's in place. I think when it starts to become a problem is when, for example, when I first heard about the LawFi DAO and this different model, I was unsure how much was going to be artificial intelligence or a decision tree or automated services compared to a distribution model to farm work to people who were members that could effectively review it and put some time into it. And it also occurs to me that we have to think about, like, to be a lawyer, to be a solicitor in New South Wales or any state, you need to be part of a law association, the different registration mechanisms, and that's true of a lot of other professions too, that there's a compulsory professional scheme to participate with. And therefore, the extent to which this would need to be a member or the membership of the existing scheme would extend to cover the advice given under this. And I think it all comes down to recognising whether it's an individual's advice that can be traced back to the lawyer who's providing it. And this is regardless of the fee charged or the share or the benefit structure that sits there. But if the actual knowledge or advice or reliance can be placed back to an individual, then I don't see how it's different in the view of the current world. It's only when a group would come up with something or be embedded by a group or something in some automated sort of process or decision tree, that would be then who's the responsible person or body for that advice to be given. All of these things are solvable. I think the biggest challenge from an insurance point of view is understanding what sits behind the advice that's been given and who should we be going to, just without trying to define that at the start and say that's it, is actually to say whose advice is it? What's the mechanism? What's the purpose of the organisation? How's it embedded? What makes this different to the current world? Going back to your original point, which is the LawFi concept of what is it doing? You talked about this kind of more autonomous or more diverse or more accessible or more, what does that actually mean for what the service is? And what makes it different? And that's the bit that it's hard to comment any more really about the insurance, is because until what makes it different, it's hard to determine how to respond to it differently.
Yeah, incredible. I'll just make one comment and then I've got somebody else. But the potential of this technology is helping open our eyes. And so LawFi DAO is very much in the context of lawyers or professionals and what they can give in terms of pay-to-rely products. Quite manual still, even though it's technology assisted. But when you raise the concept of AI, we're already seeing the criticisms come through for ChatGPT that it is calling on all of the data that is available to it, public data, but not attributing the sources that it's relied on in order to come to what it's produced. And some of its competitors, I've heard, are seeking to include that attribution for the generative AI. And what NFTs do, and what we're still working through, is they allow a technology, a container that has got integrity. So if Joni, Pirovich or Bedazzle has put content out there and it is linked back to my address, what we're seeing with artworks and royalty streams going back to an original address, that is a technology framework that is assistive, so that when there are generative AI models that will call on the content that I've produced and that others have produced, we also have a native technology framework, not just for the attribution to me, but a proper commercial model back to me, which might result in benefit as well as liability. And there's this criticism that DAOs are adverse to employment relationships, that it's a core contributor model, it's independent contractor, and it's taking away from the benefits that you might get as an employee. But when you step outside of that lens, it's actually giving us, and thank you to Will for really turning the light bulb on for me here, it's giving us now a long tail, or like a long tail commission sense that I don't have to contribute something to a company and the company is responsible for commercializing that contribution or that IP. Once I've put something out in the world, it can be picked up and attributed back to me outside of the container of employment, perhaps. So in that sense, it could be more empowering. Now, in raising that does take us outside of the legal model, the employment model, and engenders or requires a level of trust to say, what if these benefits don't actually pan out? Then it was a worse off deal for people who would have been employees. So there's a bit of blind faith here too. Now, in raising these sorts of things, the kinds of people that I would love to make a comment and just some reactions are Alana, Kushner and Kelsey in particular. But I see, Miles, that you've got your hand up. So if we go Miles, Alana and Kelsey, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I don't want to break the flow, but talking about insurance is really about, insurance is one way to manage risks. So the starting point is to identify the risks, how likely they are and what impact could they have. And then there are a number of ways to manage risks, and insurance is just one of those. And so you work your way through what way is the most appropriate for the organisation or the people involved to manage those risks. So I think that's the first thing, you've got to identify the risks. Second thing is, earlier in the presentation, which I thought was fantastic, you talked about between stakeholders and members. I just point out, so not to contain our thoughts, that there are unincorporated associations, quite large ones, which have been around for thousands of years, and are very successful in one sense, because they've been around for thousands of years and have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of members, and they're faith-based organisations. And in law, they don't work on a contract. They are a consensual compact, usually around a statement of principles and beliefs. And when I have a look at what Joni's done, I get the view that the statement of principles that she has devised is very central to the organisation, which has many similarities to a church or faith-based organisation. So I'm wondering if we don't cramp our style by immediately going to contracts and enforceable contracts, and that consensual compacts, which are not enforceable by external legal apparatus, may be an option in certain circumstances. I'm not proposing them as a solution, I'm saying we ought not to cramp our style by adopting the company shareholder model. We know it well, but it's not the only model. And we're dealing with something that is very different. I've never struck anything like it in my life. So it is really quite different. So I think we need to keep everything on the tabletop to see whether it'll fit to suit our purposes.
It's a good observation, Miles. We have looked at a lot of contemporary organisations who have interesting models that I think could be used, copied, or at least used as an inspiration in some of the mechanisms. So you're right, we can't ignore what's out there. And in fact, we want to go out and find everything that's possible and look at it hard and go, can we make use of this?
And I think that'll go down as the quote of the day. We ought not to cramp our style. It's fantastic. All right, Alana, are you in a position to offer some comments?
I am, thank you. One comment in general is around the idea of accessibility. And I guess what struck me with the presentation is, who are we designing for? Is it the lawyers that will be part of the DAO? Or is it others who might be using the DAOs? Identifying who that audience is, I think, is quite important. That's just my sense at the moment, so I hope that helps.
The supporting mechanisms we've got are very much on stakeholder mapping, and Andrew used the terms expectation needs. We go further than that. We have association with someone who's developed an expectation needs promises model, which we're actively using. And it is about trust. To answer that question, from our perspective, we have to have everyone. LawFi DAO, yes, we need to identify, this is part of the member classes, we also need to identify what are our key stakeholder groups, who do we have to take into consideration.
And just to add some colour on that, to do LawFi DAO and to give it some colour, we needed to pick an operational protocol or a thing to do other than just to start ourselves. So it felt more real. But in that example I gave before about NFTs as a technology container, that it's trying to bring back our activities to the more global and what can apply to any activity, not just the fact that it's in law. So that is our lens that we'll approach our initial experiments with. It doesn't have to be. We can have a vote and do a different industry or profession. We might need to vote on a change of name too, but it's by the by. It's really just to try and go through our processes and our experiments, learn from them in one lens, and then redact it back or bring it back to what everybody can benefit from and open source that learning. Very much a long journey ahead of us. Kelsey, are you in a position to talk?
Yeah, first of all, thanks, Joni, for facilitating, and absolute props to Multilateral Group as well. As Joni mentioned in the chat, my primary research method as an academic in this space is one of an ethnographer, so spending a lot of time deliberately hanging out in these communities such as DAOs and trying to understand what's going on, observing a lot of the governance dynamics as well as the regulatory and compliance challenges and these kinds of things. And then I also hold a position doing governance research with a firm called Block Science. They're more engineers on the design side, but it's really interesting to think about a DAO from a design perspective today. I absolutely agree with some of the intuitions around classes of stakeholders or membership and clearly delineating that the functional requirements of the DAO stem from a clearly articulated purpose. And I really benefited and learned a lot from the sort of legal and regulatory lens. And I think, some of my research has been on cooperatives and DAOs, or what can DAOs learn from cooperatives. So I think, there's really deep experience obviously there as well that we'll benefit from. To second some of the comments that have recently been made, I think there are interesting or potentially novel approaches in some DAO communities that mean that we don't have to reinvent everything. So some of the conversations about guilds or expert level things, I would call that subgroups, or DAOs would call themselves as having polycentricity or subsidiarity. You've talked more about subsidiarity now and more sort of those centralized points of regulatory compliance. But DAOs call that sub-DAOs within an overarching DAO, and I can point to more deep empirical examples of that. That was the main one that came to my mind, and just that there are some arbitrary maps as well around different kind of governance options. Like we talked about templating for how DAOs might structure themselves. I think that's still hugely valuable to do in a coherent way. I think that's part of the remit of LawFi DAO as well. But there's some arbitrary things which you could reference or draw on for that kind of process. And those were my initial thoughts.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Just a quick one. Just with in non-profits, but also in commercial companies, there are often members with diametrically opposed wants or needs or expectations of the organisation. And what the governance body does is mediate those needs to funnel everybody to the desired, agreed direction. So that mediation is really important, or else you find yourself with only one class of members who may not be able to achieve your purpose.
And we're seeing that in DAOs already, but they don't have the background legal frameworks of minority shareholder protections or hostile takeovers. So all of that is emerging afresh, and perhaps could probably learn something from our existing legal frameworks, or maybe not. I want to just go quickly to Greg Metzmacher. If you're in a position to talk, I would love to hear your initial responses to even just legal structure and ways that you would normally see some of the parts of LawFi DAO go about, not the whole as an unincorporated association, but different entities for different parts.
Yeah, I responded a little bit just before on the email ahead of this meeting. I was kind of interested, and it's almost a question back at you, Joni. Is the idea here, and probably maybe even too late for this concept, but is the idea here to set up a DAO and test it and try and do that, and then use pay to rely as a model for doing that as something to do? Or is it to stand up pay to rely model, and if we can do that via a DAO, great. Maybe we do it for a corporate first and then migrate to a DAO. And understanding that priority perhaps from you, as well as, is there some features about the DAO that makes pay to rely better to operate in that environment than a corporate environment? Do things hold together better or the like? And therefore, what sort of aspects of the DAO do we need to try and protect and consider as we do the build out?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in the very early days, I really, as Bedazzle, just wanted to launch the pay to rely protocol and do all of my legal advices and templates that way. But the majority of my client base is DAOs. And I questioned myself to say, why would I do this as just a centralized company when I love DAO first thinking? And to release it as Bedazzle would have been through a limited liability company. Maybe I would have had a separate subsidiary to quarantine the liability exposure from public use of that protocol. It probably would have been much more quick of an exercise and maybe would be in market already by now. But I just also understood the extreme need for the public and the regulators and judiciary to understand DAOs and exactly the question that ASIC raised, why can't you just do it within one of the existing legal structures? So that, Kelsey, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but like that pedagogical process of building a community, going through the exercise of an unwrapped or like an unincorporated association of persons, and ourselves as a community finding out what we feel most comfortable, and just getting that soft consensus and eventually confirmation that maybe a lot of our membership base or initial stakeholder group are not comfortable with that exposure to unlimited liability. And for these particular activities, we do need to think about a different structure. And that learning process in itself sends a message to the policymakers and politicians to say, we're not supportive of innovation in an unwrapped DAO sense in Australia because people are driven back to the well-known limited liability entity, whereas other jurisdictions are adopting laws that just give a DAO legal personhood and limited liability from the moment that it launches its membership token or its treasury wallet. And then the activities of members for that DAO are contained in a limited liability package that's recognised distinct from them. So it was the learning exercise as well as wanting to do it DAO first. And I don't mind. I had to let go of wanting to predict a particular outcome. And I've fully become okay with where the community directs, where this experiment needs to go, whether it be the winding up of LawFi DAO as an unincorporated association or restructuring it to one or more legal entities. That's what I want to see. What does the community want out of these digital organization design workshops? What do they feel most comfortable with? And I'll support the community in that journey.
Great. To your point raised in your email about whether pay to rely could be delivered through corporate as distinct from what makes it possible better doing it in a DAO, I think as we unpack across the series of workshops and we look at this dynamic attribution and allocation system model that we're talking about in workshop 2, but then really fleshing it out in workshop 3, that's a far more applicable design construct in a digital environment like a DAO than it could be delivered under established corporates with all their areas of corporate ownership of IP, etc. And it goes back to the earlier discussion where we were talking about the possibility of people or entities owning their own IP and being able to both benefit but also be liable for their activities within that. And I think that's where we're looking at the benefit of using a DAO.
Yeah, alignment is the big point there, that between the members, the users and the like, the DAO probably, I'm not sure exactly how, but the DAO probably lets you get better alignment across what you're offering and how you're offering it.
This is what we've got to experiment with, and what incentivizes participation in the building of a community around a public good. So if the pay to rely protocol is released as open source software, it doesn't have to just be used by lawyers. It can be used by other professionals or other persons that really just want that attribution back to them as their content is picked up. That's more of where we want to go with the DAO, that a centralized company that you have to be a shareholder in order to receive profits from. That's an economic model that I just don't align with anymore. And I think that you do need to look broadly to more stakeholders other than just the shareholders in where your organization is going. But it's obviously a controversial view because there's a lot of successes still to be made through a centralized company. And a lot of public good.
We also want to break open, conceptually, we want to break open what do we mean by benefit? Because at the moment, with the current structure, benefit is pretty well restricted to equity or bonus or revenue of some sort. Let's crack it open. Let's not be constrained by what we recognise as benefit.
Yeah, good. Looking forward to it.
Let's perhaps use a few minutes to one of the core visions of LawFi DAO as laid out in the white paper is this desire to be a benchmark, to look at being representing a best practice standard, and how can LawFi DAO lead the way and be recognised globally or as a global dynamic self-regulatory digital organisation. And so I think it would be really great to get just perhaps in coming back to what would constitute minimum collaborative best practice industry standards for LawFi DAO.
Susanna, we haven't heard from you. I'd love to hear your point of view on best practice industry standards for a DAO, including LawFi DAO, if you're still there.
I am here. Look, this is a really tricky one I'm a lawyer, and my mind always goes to all the things that will go wrong and all the things we can't do and why it would be different. So I don't really have a good answer for you at this stage, Joni, on that one. I'd like to take that on notice and come back with a more sort of well thought out idea. I think I really liked the point that was made earlier about trying to understand what the differences are. If you're really mapping this against traditional practices and actually shining a light on all of those differences, the simple things in my mind is supervision of junior lawyers. That's a really basic thing that happens in traditional law firms. How would you go about arranging that? And how do you set up processes that are enduring for these sorts of organizations where ultimately humans will be motivated by self-interest? And there's a degree of collectivism, but ultimately at the end of the day, people will participate if they are getting some kind of benefit. And I love that call out to what is a benefit. And a benefit will be different. I think it was Duncan who made that point. Benefits will be different for different people. So that human experiment of en masse, how does that feed into best practice, I think is also really interesting. So I'm thinking about this both through the human level and then having spent 20 years inside big law firms. How do you replicate those sorts of concepts where you take away a lot of the hierarchy, the structure that you have in traditional organizations? What would you replace that with, and how much of it do you need to replace, and how much can you let be organic? And yeah, so great thought experiment for me.
My response to that is I think that the tools are there. What needs to be replaced, I can't answer. We're mainly talking services organisation, and why we haven't gone away from fully automated services organisation, because it's hard to define a service, but it's not impossible. And I think once we've started, it's always easier to edit than create, and we've done some creation. So I think if we can get some momentum on some clarity of service organisation, your example of a junior lawyer being guys, that's a workflow. That's a workflow with instruction or work. It's an appropriately designed service delivery. I think you can do that. And that means that can be farmed out and managed much easier than the human one.
And look, and that's really interesting. I guess when you're putting what are the broader incentives? So if I'm inside the firm that I work for now, it's part of my job description. It's part of an expectation on my KPIs that I'm supervising junior lawyers and spending an awful lot of time doing it. So how do you build those sorts of incentives into a DAO structure? Again, it's a really simple little example, but I'm sure there's a way to do it. But I take to a point, Duncan, that it is a workflow thing, but it's a workflow that works in the traditional services business because of a whole lot of other expectations that are either documented or not documented, or perhaps because you've grown up in an environment where you've seen other people doing the same thing and you've picked that up a little bit by osmosis, as well as a contractor. I don't think it's written anywhere in my employment contract that I perform that function, but it's a big part of my job.
Well,
so anyway, yeah, interesting. Those sorts of subtle things that you would
so
play
I think,
around.
again, that comes down to defining what a benefit is and what an attribution is. So the ability to actually sit down and go, how do we acknowledge, how do we attribute, how do we do the attribution, how do we allocate benefit, what that benefit is. And look, the big issue here is you get what you measure for. So understanding the relationship between your measures, your success measures, and the incentivification is going to be critical. And also
that's a really important point, because another thing that's very difficult to do in traditional law firms, we often talk about the fact that front-end lawyers don't necessarily have the feedback loop of when their clauses get litigated. That sort of feedback loop, it's easy to put things out there, but are they of the right qualities? And some of that assessment you can't make until later on. So that's a critical point, Duncan. I think it's a point very well made. What is a good job?
Fascinating discussion.
What springs to mind when you ask the question, what makes a good DAO? What's best practice? And we see in the nonprofit sectors a thing called isomorphism. And that's just a big word to mean that the more these organizations deal with each other and have professional drivers and professional people, the more and more they look the same. A car rental business and an airline business and a mining business, and a hospital, they all look very much the same and are organized on the same ways. And there are very few successful organizations that can break out of that business model. My thought here is that DAOs are so new and so emerging that they haven't had a chance to go down the isomorphic path. And so we don't know. It's up to us. We don't know what a good one is. It's all new. It's all in the firmament. And so there is no best practice. We make best practice. But anyway, that's the thought that came into my little kernel of a brain.
It's not a small brain. The thing that's bouncing around for me is scalability, right? I think what jumps out whenever you start talking about digital organizations is that there's this assumption that it's infinitely scalable, subject to whatever, but there's no limitation around who it can service, where it can grow to, how it can respond. And typically services that are online, the computer's generating it, whether it's AI or this or that, smart contracts, whatever, it's programmed. And therefore, when I look at that question 4, what constitutes minimum and collaborative best practice industry standards, it seems to me that we really need to understand whether we need to gear this up to be that infinitely scalable thing, like how many lawyers can get involved, how much, how many different areas of practice. I think one of the questions that got asked before was, is it being designed for the consumer or customer getting information out? What's the purpose? And therefore, how does it grow and respond over time? And what limits a new lawyer and advice coming in? How do we maintain quality? When you're a lawyer, you register in a state or in a whatever and get accepted, but then there's disciplinary stuff and you can get kicked out. Like, how does that link back between the qualification, the real world, and the maintenance of that? And when I think it came up right at the start about maintaining membership of different classes during the process, how is that done? Anyway, it's the scalability issue. I think it's important to understand what the ambition is, because if we're planning for it to be virtually infinitely scalable, then it requires a lot more attention and thought than if we're saying it's going to be limited in nature and focused in a particular area or domain or control piece.
We're out of time.
Oh, there you go. Time flies when you're having fun. All right, we'll say one thing and then hand over to you to formally close, Andrew.
Yep, sure.
I just wanted to remind everybody that in the era of the Impressionists, it brought us Monet, and the name Impressionist was given as a derogatory term. It was because everybody was used to paintings that were very articulate about quite posh scenery, that when the Impressionists came along and had quite blurry, broad brush strokes out painting the peasants, which was the criticism, and painting the outdoors, they were called Impressionists because they were impersonating real artists. They didn't finish their paintings and they were heavily criticized. But with the passage of time, their artworks are now so famous and they immemorialized the essence and the feeling of that era. And this is exactly what I see with DAOs and having more discussion in Discord, having more transparent discussions and governance and operations. And it might seem messy. We don't have a good way of understanding it yet, but all of these contributions are immemorializing the sentiment at the time that the governance and the legal frameworks that we have right now might not be working for all of us. And we're on our way to moving towards something that more reflects the essence of what we're really asking for. So it might feel messy, but it's beautiful in its messiness, and just keep that in the back of your mind and look at the beautiful Monet water lilies to continue your spirits every time that, you know, the blockchain as a technology or crypto continues to get criticized in the media. That's all from me. Andrew, over to you. And thank you again to you and the team for hosting this workshop one, and looking forward to the rest of them.
Thanks, Joni. And it's an absolute pleasure. After this, we'll be shooting out, and Joni will do this via email, a soft copy handout of the post-workshop assignment. Basically, it's a reiteration of the pictures that Duncan walked through earlier, and also some of the narrative as to the various parts. But the piece to put your attention to, Appendice A, which is about the exemplar assumption list, and it effectively lays up what the equivalence layer looks like, what the current state is, and what some of the potential next steps would be. So we'd really appreciate you having a look at that, pulling it apart, coming back with the insights, thinking about where there might be gaps, and also keep that consideration going about how you can contribute to the overall process. So that's it for this week. We're back on at the same time next week, 1 o'clock. Thank you very much for your attendance. We've had some really good collective minds on the call today, and we hope you've all absorbed some really interesting information and have got plenty to contribute back. And we'll get back into Discord in terms of looking at some of that discourse around the self-reflection. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.